All right. Good afternoon, everyone, and let's get started. Thank you for being here today for this webinar presented by Behavioral Economics in Action at Rotman in partnership with the Behavioral Science and Policy Association. This is our sixth webinar of this academic year. My name is Lorenzo, and I'm a first-year PhD in marketing at Rotman, a Bayer research coordinator and the moderator for today's webinar. Behavioral Economics in Action at Rotman, or Bayer, is a research center at the University of Toronto's Rotman School of Management, whose three programmatic missions are to research, to educate, and engage in meaningful outreach with our academic, governmental, and industry partners. These monthly webinars are our way to hear first and foremost from academics and practitioners who are making a meaningful impact in the world of behavioral insight. In particular, behaviorally informed businesses and evidence-based public policy. We're delighted today to have Tanjim Hossain, an associate professor at the University of Toronto, presenting carrots versus sticks and other incentive stories. Before I introduce Tanjim, I would like to go over the ground rules for this webinar. Following this introduction, our speaker will deliver a 30 to 35 minutes presentation. During the presentation, please submit questions for our speakers by clicking the chat tab at the top right of your WebEx screen and typing into the entry box. These questions will be visible to all of the participants. At the end of the talk, and with time permitting, we will have a Q&A session in which I will select questions from the chat tab to ask our speaker. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce Tanjim Hossain. As mentioned before, Tanjim is an associate professor at the Department of Management, UTM, at the University of Toronto. He's also cross-appointment to the Rotman School of Management, the Department of Economics, and the Institute for Management and Innovation. He serves as the director of the Master of Management of Innovation, MMI program, and as the chief scientist at the Behavioral Economics in Action at Rotman Bayer Center. His main research interests include behavioral economics, applied microeconomics, and quantitative marketing, especially using field and laboratory experiments to test the validity of theoretical predictions in the real world. His research has been published in American Economic Review, Management Science, Marketing Science, Quarterly Journal of Economics, and the Review of Economic Studies, and has been featured in The Economist, USA Today, and other news outlets. He serves as an associate editor of the journal Management Science. So thank you, Tanjim, for being here today, and please take it away.
Thanks, Lorenzo, for the kind introduction. Good afternoon, everyone. Let me just get started. Great. I'm assuming everybody can see the screen. So the broad goal for this webinar is to discuss how we can utilize insights from behavioral economics to make workers more productive, which is a central question in any economy. So in economics, we frequently study optimal design of incentive contracts between a principal, for example, an employer, and an agent, for example, an employee. Other examples of principals and agents would be shareholders of a company who don't run the company are principals, while the actual administration, assuming they don't have any stake in the company, are agents. So the main idea is that income or profits of the principal depends on the efforts exerted by agents, and typically the actual efforts are not observable. So as efforts are costly, agents, or say employees, have incentives to shirk or expend less effort. So economists propose different performance-based incentive contracts to circumvent the principal agent problem, or what we call, say, moral hazard problem. To some extent, it's not completely avoidable, But one issue with many solutions economists propose is that they're very complicated and cannot be really replicated or used in regular work situations. So the first question, and an important question we can ask, is that how can we use simple incentive contracts uh, to improve productivity of workers in the real world? Specifically, can like how does behavioral biases um, affect incentive schemes in the workplace? Can we use behavioral biases uh, to write simple contracts, but slightly different from standard simple contracts that make people work harder? So many of our the behavioral insights we have or behavioral biases we have come from laboratory experiments in psychology or uh, economics. So one important question is, do insights from the lab carry over to a natural work environment? Specifically, some people would say that market forces and long-term interactions, experience of people, and so on, do sanitize behavioral biases quite a bit. And a general and like main big question for economists is that uh, do predictions from economic theory bear out in actual workplace? So the specific that's broad motivation for one direction of my research. The specific questions that I will try to discuss today is, can we use the concept of loss aversion, which I will discuss soon, uh, to motivate workers to produce more? Um, then I would also discuss how the impact of behavioral bias depend on incentive schemes. So a lot of times when we talk about behavioral biases or nudges and so on, sometimes we think of those independently, and one may sometimes think that the a given behavioral bias would affect in an economic situation uh, the same way, independent of the economic structure of the problem you're thinking about. So we ask that question, specifically how loss aversion interacts with the incentive schemes, the monetary incentive schemes used in the workplace. And third question I will be discussing is how the perception of a task affects people's response to monetary incentives. Specifically, do people work more when they're paid instead of for free, or do they work more when they're paid more? Or do they reciprocate to higher payments and so on? So let's start. I'll start by talking about loss aversion. Um, let's think of a thought experiment. Suppose uh, there are like you are given the option to choose between two lotteries. Lottery A is you'll win $1,000 with probability 0.25 or 25% chance, and win nothing with probability 7 points of 0.75 or 75% chance. Uh, if you want a concrete example, you can think of that I will toss a fair coin twice, and if the head of the coin comes up both times, you'll win $1,000. In the other three scenarios, um, when we get at least one tail, uh, you will get nothing. Uh, that's lottery A. Lottery B is you will win $250 for sure. So many of us would choose lottery B in this situation, winning $250 for sure, instead of getting lottery A, where you earn $250 in expectation, but there is a very good chance you won't win anything. This is called risk aversion. There are many studies looking at it. So one of the studies, uh, and in general, typically say around less than 20% people choose lottery A, more than 80% of people choose lottery B. Now let's have another thought experiment. Suppose I give you $1,000, and now think about this set of lotteries. Lottery C is with 25% chance you'll lose nothing. You don't, and with 75% chance you'll lose $1,000. On the other hand, lottery D is you will lose $750 for sure. So you basically have to choose one of those lotteries. Both are bad, but in one case you have to give me $750 in lottery D, and in lottery C you don't have to give me anything with a quarter chance, and with three-quarter chance you'll have to give me $1,000. So when people have looked at this kind of lotteries with say subjects in the lab, overwhelmingly people choose lottery C. So minority of people, again around like less than 20%, choose losing $750 for sure. So now if you think back a little, the first set of lotteries and the second set of lotteries are actually exactly the same, because here I gave you $1,000 to begin with. So if you add that up, basically lottery C is you get $1,000 with probably a quarter and nothing with probability three-quarters, while lottery D is you get $250 for sure. But so in some sense, your decision should be the same in like similar if in both cases. If you chose lottery A in the first set, you should choose lottery C here. While if you choose lottery B in the first case, you should choose lottery D in the second case. But as I mentioned, many people would choose lottery B in the first case, but lottery C in the second case. So these two can be explained by reference dependence and loss aversion. So let's talk about loss aversion at first. The idea of loss aversion, which is very intuitive, is that the happiness you get from gaining $100 is smaller than the negative happiness you get from losing $100 in magnitude. So that, as I said, that I believe is quite intuitive. Also, the other thing is reference dependence. The idea is that instead of looking at, say, total monetary gain or total monetary loss, people look at their gains or prospects relative to some reference. So that is considered reference dependence. And seeming contradiction in the previous two slides that I talked about can very easily be explained when there is both loss aversion and reference dependence. And these two ideas are central to prospect theory proposed by Danny Kahneman and Amos Tversky in their famous 1979 paper. So loss aversion is something that is very, like, it's a very robust phenomenon in the lab. People have shown its presence in the lab, in the field. Our question is, can we actually use loss aversion to improve worker productivity? So specifically, can we just use framing, simple framing manipulation to influence productivity? So specifically, an incentive scheme framed positively as a gain per firm differently from the same incentive scheme, but with a different framing, specifically negatively framed as a loss. So the standard economic theory suggests no difference. People should just look at the since we are going to compare monetarily equivalent incentive schemes. People should just look at the monetary content, and say employees should expend the same amount of effort. On the other hand, if people are loss averse and also a reference dependent, if we can successfully manipulate the reference using this framing, uh, then then prospect as prospect theory conjectures, uh, then people would work harder under the loss frame. On the so even though loss aversion is quite well established, but in the lab, but so and that would suggest that loss frame would work better. Another viewpoint could be that a positively framed uh, incentive scheme might actually make people happier and invigorate them to work harder. So from even a behavioral economist's point of view, it's not so clear what would happen. Um, so we had the opportunity to work with a large-scale electronics manufacturer in China, uh, and they let us work with their factory workers to test the effect of these incentive schemes, and that led to papers, to published papers. One with John List, and the second one with Fu Hai Hong and John List. Um, so let's talk about the first paper. So in this paper, we uh, went to this factory and offered workers a 4-week-long incentive scheme. So as researchers, we provided the fund, but the workers received letters from the management that there is an incentive scheme, which is actually not uncommon for these workers when they have there is, say, like higher demand for the product, or the company has a deadline, or they want to raise productivity. They actually provide different kind of incentive schemes. So a set of workers uh, received letters offering them a bonus scheme. Everybody, the underlying bonus scheme was the same, but for some of the workers, the bonus was framed as a reward, framed positively. So they were told that there is a 4-week-long incentive program. At the end of 4 weeks, they will receive 80 renminbi for each week, each of the 4 weeks. The target was achieved. So if they were told a specific target, productivity target, hourly productivity target. So if they reach that target of productivity every week, they would get 320 renminbi. If they get it only 3 weeks, they would get 240 renminbi, and so on. On the other hand, some other workers received the punishment framing. They were told that there is an incentive scheme, and at the end of 4 weeks, they are promised a bonus of 320 renminbi. But before the payment is made, 80 renminbi will be deducted for each week they did not achieve the target. So this is exactly same monetary incentive scheme, but one is positively framed, the reward, and one is negatively framed, the punishment. So the letters we used, you can see that they were they're exactly how I described. In the first case, they are just directly told that they will get 80 renminbi bonus for every week if their productivity is above or equal to some target K units per hour. In the punishment treatment, they are first told they will receive a salary enhancement, which is basically a bonus of 320 renminbi at the end of 4 weeks. However, if they don't, for every week they don't reach the target, the enhancement would be reduced by 80 renminbi. So, in some sense, in both cases, we are giving them carrots or a performance-based bonus, but under the reward treatment, carrot is dressed as a carrot. In the punishment treatment, the carrot is dressed as a stick. So some other particulars. We had 8 different sets. There were 6 team sets. So each set did different kind of work, and given the constraint of the workplace, we could work with 6 sets which had like two identically formed teams, and 2 individual sets. Within individual sets, we had around 11 or 12 individual workers. So within a given set, everybody did the same task. Everybody experienced both frames. So this is to control both order effect by randomizing the ordering, whether you get reward first or punishment first. Also, this controls for across team and time heterogeneity using difference in differences method, because there is also the productivity also to some extent depends on the company's demand and so on, also like upstream supply and many different things. So there may be some heterogeneity across time, so to control for that, or 2 teams may be different in their base productivity. Also to control for that, we all teams and individuals experience both frames, and we just to make sure there is no order effect, we randomize the ordering. In total, we had 165 workers. Their average salary is weekly salary is 300 to 375 renminbi. That means that 80 renminbi represented more than 20% of their weekly income. So it was a substantial bonus. So workers were unaware of the experiment, and management was unaware of our exact hypothesis, which is very important, these kind of controls in experiments. We use targets using pre-experiment productivity, and we monitored quality for both the teams and the individuals. So let's look at some results. So first, looking at raw numbers, we can show that framing matters for teams. Out of 6 different sets of work, in 5 cases, reward led to higher productivity punishment led to higher productivity than reward treatments. So positive means productivity was higher under punishment, and this is used from using difference in differences method. With individuals, we had less data, and so if we just look at the sets, for one of the sets, there was a clear large framing effect. The other case, not so much. So these are just starting point. We actually could we had enough data to run a regression analysis controlling for individual or team heterogeneity and so on. What we find, as expected, also for regressions, we could use our data from like before the experiment started. So from those benchmark data, we could actually calculate how each frame, like bonus under each frame, increased productivity relative to when there was no bonus. So what we find is bonus increased productivity under both frames, and which is not surprising. Under both frames, we are giving them more money for producing more, and they indeed produce more. Like their productivity per hour went up. One nice thing is it had no impact on the quality of work. So we measured quality, which was also very clearly monitored by the firm, and there was no impact on quality of work. So specifically for the teams, the increase in hourly productivity was 8.5% under reward and 9.5% under punishment relative to when there was no bonus. So, and this difference is statistically significant. So just from the wording of the contract or framing, incentives as punishment increased productivity by 1%, which may not sound huge, but if you can make workers increase worker productivity by even 1% with just no cost, just framing, that actually has a long-lasting impact on the economy. So for individuals, the increase in hourly productivity for reward and punishments were 11.8% and 13.5%. So again, punishment increased productivity more than reward. But this difference was not statistically significant. One big reason for that is we had a smaller amount of data for individuals, but there may be some other difference between individuals and teams in terms of how efficient this kind of framing or loss aversion is. So just some other information. So we did some back of the calculation whether such uh, whether um, such bonus program was beneficial for the firm because obviously bonuses cost money. Productivity went up, but did it go up enough? We calculated that given the amount of money that we spent and given the productivity increase, actually this productivity increase was beneficial, or it was worth it. So one question you might ask is that why, though it seems that framing as a loss, framing a bonus as a punishment works pretty well in increasing productivity, but this increase seems stronger for teams instead of individuals. So one thing is the intrinsic motivation of letting others down may be strong in teams, which would intensify loss aversion. When you are, so when you are working by yourself, you are only letting yourself down, but in a team, you are also letting others down. Also, there can be some like social losses issued, like Weber and She show that social losses are important in teams. So the pressure of not being the one to cause the team, the bonus can be high. So here also culture may have some impact. And so the idea of losing face may be important in a team, while for individuals, even if I don't get the reach the productivity target, not many people know other than my manager. So the impact of that may be smaller. And one important thing, and that is that kind of relates to what I talked about at the beginning. Uh, it just happens that compared to the worker in teams, individual workers were older and had longer tenure, and also even among team sets, age and tenure seems to reduce framing effect. So what that tells us is that while uh, in a labor setting in the real workplace, uh, 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 the market setting, experience does not like the loss impact of loss aversion doesn't go away completely, but maybe experience does reduce the impact a bit. Okay, so let's move on to the second paper, which is very closely related, and this is joined with a journalist and also Fu Hai Hong. So here we study some similar framing effects with 4 of the teams from the previous paper. But here, so in the previous paper, a team would win a bonus if their productivity was higher than a predetermined target. The target was determined from their pre-experiment productivity or their baseline productivity. But now, instead of having an exogenously set productivity level, the 2 teams that are identically structured would compete against each other for the bonus. So basically, one of the teams will win bonus. Before in the previous paper, both teams could win the bonus if both produced higher than the target, and the while and or neither might win the bonus in a given week. Here, every week, one of the teams would win the bonus, specifically team with higher average hourly productivity. And in a 4-week long round, one of the teams will be offered this scheme as a reward, the other will be offered as a punishment. And the frames were reversed in the second 4-week long round, as we did before. The target productivity is so endogenously determined, unlike in the previous study. And the important thing in terms of the incentive scheme, so the framing part, the behavioral part of this incentive contract, these 2 incentive contracts, previous paper and this paper, are exactly the same. However, the incentive scheme, the monetary part, is different because the bonus depends on relative productivity rather than absolute productivity. So what did we see? Bonus schemes raised productivity under both treatments, and there was no effect on quality. What we find that compared to the reward treatment, productivity did slightly increase in the punishment treatment in absolute terms, but the effect was very small and not at all statistically significant. So framing effects now seems insignificant in terms of absolute productivity. However, if you look at which team won for each week the contest, then the team under reward lost more than the team under punishment. Specifically, the team under punishment was more than 35% more likely to win than the contest than the team under reward. So so this is a large effect, and we don't find any effect, any similar result in the previous paper. If we were producing more than the other team was not important, but if we go back and look at the numbers, we see that there was no difference. So the framing effect in determining the winner is really large, because here people were paid based on who was the winner, not how much you produce, but whether you produce more than the other team. So these 2 studies together, what are the main lessons? Loss aversion can be used in increasing productivity and seems to be stronger in groups, especially from the first paper. That's what we find. But the second thing we find, which is very important, is that interaction of incentives and behavioral biases is very important. Biases are manifested along the line of incentives. So loss aversion is important in both papers actually, but the direction in which loss aversion is manifested depends on the incentive schemes. So that means that incentive schemes needs to be based on the incentive contracts to utilize behavioral bias, uh, uh, and in there the incentive schemes used need to be based on the objective function of the agent or the employees. So, and in general, understanding institutional detail such as workplace context, incentive structure, in general, knowledge of the field is extremely important in uh, uh, designing optimal policy. So I think there, I would move on to the last paper we are going to talk. I see that I see there are some questions about this paper. So there are some other things I could have talked, but I think I see some questions that where those would come up. So the remaining, say, 5 or so minutes, let's talk about something else. So specifically, we are going to talk about extrinsic and intrinsic motivation to work. So there is some evidence that giving people money for a certain behavior relative to paying them nothing can actually reduce the possible probability that they will engage in a task. Um, and some have argued that monetary incentives always reduce people's intrinsic motivation to work. So, what is intrinsic motivation to work, and what is extrinsic motivation to work? Um, so, for our purposes, extrinsic motivation to work basically is provided by incentives such as money or career concerns and so on. So, economists typically think of when they think about incentive contracts, they really think about only traditionally only extrinsic motivation. But of course, there is a lot of evidence, and behavioral economists, on the other hand, think about both extrinsic and intrinsic motivation to work. Intrinsic motivation to work would be the motivation to work just for the work itself. How much you care about the company, how interesting our work is, if you have some kind of social preference. And so there is an argument that when you pay people money, intrinsic motivation to work goes down a lot, and in some situations it can even crowd out effort. Just giving them a little bit of money makes them work less than if they work for free. So people accept that intrinsic motivation is also very important. The question is how where does intrinsic motivation come from, and how does that depend on the nature of the task? So in this cartoon I found, a boss said that I went to a seminar, and uh, it like I need he needs to he learned that he needs to help the workers become more intrinsically motivated to work. Then he says, so be intrinsically motivated or you'll be fired. So that's probably not the best way to induce intrinsic motivation. So the main question we ask is that this idea that offering money crowd out effort in a effort, most of the results actually come from laboratory games or pro-social tasks uh, uh, such as voluntarism and so on. Variation in social preference comes from wage differentials, but they don't controlling social preference. They don't change wages. So what we do in a paper with King Lee, we do run a natural field experiment with data entry workers, where all the workers participate in the same work, and it was a real task of entering data. But we induce social preference among some workers by making the task sound altruistic, frame it as a favor as opposed to work, and also we vary the wages, and we look at interaction of intrinsic motivation from social preference, favor versus work, and extrinsic motivation, uh, that the variation comes from wages. So specifically, we recruited students for data entry work for a specific period for a specified sum, and to ensure workers do not select themselves into different treatments, we hired them all the same way. And after this specific period was over, we offered them additional work at a piece rate. So they came in for a fixed rate and practiced work, and then we offer additional work at a piece rate per line of data entry for wage rates: 0, low, medium, or high. Uh, Moreover, we vary the salience of social preference for each wage rate by framing the task differently. In the work frame, we just said that there is more data entry work, uh, and you'll be paid or not paid, or paid this rate for this work. In the other case, we say that uh, we actually have more, still more data to be entered. Can you do us a favor uh, and and enter more data? Again, the wage rate could be 0, like enter as a favor for free, but also favor for a payment, and the wage rate could be low, medium, and high. So we can look at each frame separately, the impact of giving money in like participation rate, and once they're conditional on participating and entering some data, actually how much data they enter. So first we look at participation rate. How many of them said, okay, I will enter some data. I won't leave, I will stay. I came in for an hour, but or half an hour, and I'll stay a bit longer and enter some data. So the red dotted lines is the social framework they're asked as a favor. And as predicted by uh, like previous literature on crowding out, we do see that almost 50% of the people are entering some data for free when they're asked as a favor. But when we offer a very low wage, that percentage dips to like 16%. However, when we offer relatively high wage, medium, or high, it goes up, participation rate goes up to more than 70%, and which is much higher than free. So we do see that crowding out, but at a low wage rate, but in terms of participation rate, whether they enter some data, but at high wages that go away under the social frame when people are asked to do the employer a favor. This is consistent with the literature. But what we find is in the more standard work frame, basically, and this difference is not significant, basically as we offered a higher wage rate, so for free, relatively few people entered data, less than 20% entered any more additional data. And as the wage rate went up, the participation rate went up, or at least stayed the same. These two are not statistically different. Then equally importantly, conditional on participating, we can look at how much data they entered, because they could choose how much data they want to enter. And there we find that under both frames, if we look at only people who participated and entered some data, there is no framing effect. In fact, the higher you pay them, the more amount of data they enter, or at least weekly more. And for free, even people who entered data, they entered a very small amount of data. When you pay them their data entry, and we capped it at 40 lines of data, and basically as soon as you pay them a good amount, people who participate, they enter a lot of data. So basically what we find is crowding out in terms of participation occurs, but only under the social frame, but not the work frame. And the amounts of work done conditional on working are not affected by framing. So, and there was no crowding out in terms of total work done. So the result that other people found that um, uh, providing money crowds out effort, that really depends on social preference. So when there is no social preference for regular work, actually economic theory does pretty well. The more you pay, the more likely people would participate, and conditional on participating, they will enter more data. Um, so basically, that explicitly inducing social preference raised effort for no wage, but it comes with hidden costs at positive wage in terms of quantity of work and quality of work and average amount of work when we compare social and uh, work frames. So the main insight is that workers respond to higher wage rates with higher quality. So other finding is higher quality of output only under the work frame. So so when there was higher wage conditional one working in both frames, people entered more data and got paid more per line. But the quality of output, which we didn't ask them like pay them on, but we asked to provide good quality, uh, the quality of work went up with a higher wage rate, but only under the work frame. So reciprocation or gift exchange, which is a common theme in economics, occurs only in natural labor setting, but not in social preference setting. Um, So, and one insight is that results from non-labor setting may not necessarily hold in our labor setting. And overall, economic theory actually bears out pretty well in a standard labor or work setting. So combining the three papers, lesson learned, I would say that lab experiments give us a great starting point, provides good questions to ask, but for policy relevance, we really need to carry out interventions and experiments in the field, especially when we talk about the labor market and so on. Prevalence of bounded rationality or behavioral biases depends on the context and its effect interacts with the incentive scheme. Um, but another thing, like taking lab results to um, uh, the field, is that institutional detail and nature of the work is very important in figuring out which theory is appropriate. So when we want to use these insights, we really need to know institutional detail. And finally, at least at a micro level, economic theory does a pretty good job at predicting people's behavior in many cases. Social preference is less important and useful in regular work setting than in the lab setting. And that's it. I think I can take some questions.
All right. Thank you, Tanjim, for sharing your findings with us. We'll now move to the Q&A session, and we actually have very good questions from our audience, so we'll try our best to go over them, time permitting. I would like to start with the question in the Q&A box, if that's okay.
Yeah.
How often were the workers paid? This question refers to the first part of your presentation, the first two papers that you presented. How often were the workers paid? If they were paid on a monthly basis, is there a chance that some of the groups simply weren't aware of the nuances between loss and gain frame conditions?
So they were paid at the end of 4 weeks. So, but so in that sense, it's not like that they were paid many times. However, we made sure that they understood the bonus scheme very well. And in terms of nuances of loss versus gain, I think the main part is the bonus scheme, and So I don't think the fact that they were paid only at the end of the 4 week period would affect that result. And one thing fortunate for us is that after we wrote this paper, there has been a number of papers that use similar framing manipulation. And so there is a paper by Alex Emas and Anya Samek, and another by Jonathan DeQuaid, and they all find that this impact of loss aversion in increasing productivity is quite robust. And they have very different setting. So I wouldn't worry too much about that.
Thank you, Tanjim, for the clarification. We have an additional question on the first part of the presentation.
Mhm.
Additionally to the loss aversion, do you think that endowment effect could also play a role in these results?
Not really. So the idea of endowment effect is that, like, okay, it depends on how you define endowment effect. But typically, the way we think of endowment effect is that the fact that you um, have, like, the standard endowment effect example is like you are given a mug, so you have the mug, and like you feel endowed with the mug. That creates endowment effect. Um, so in this case, they didn't have the money. So if we gave them, say, 320 renminbi, then I would say endowment effect uh, would be much stronger. So, like, in some sense, if you think of endowment effect as that, even the fact that they uh, heard that they would get 320 renminbi, that they feel that they're endowed with that, that's their money. The You can, if you call that endowment effect, the answer would be yes. But then the difference between endowment and reference is not so clear. So yeah, so I would say no, it's not. No, I don't think that's a strong, like, to the extent that we think of reference dependence and endowment or loss aversion kind of different. Endowment effect shouldn't be that strong.
We have time for one more question.
Mhm.
And this question is, what role does the demographics play in the results of the above experiment?
That's a great question, and so especially when we tried to explain why loss aversion was stronger for teams, we did some explanations did depend a bit on, like, could be different for different cultures. That said, again, this has been replicated in different settings. So I think the broad idea, like the loss aversion works in real world, that I think is pretty universal. The exact size definitely depends on culture, again, institutional details, and so on.
All right. Again, we would like to thank Tanjim for leading our webinar today. A full recording of this webinar will be available at our website by clicking the side tab labeled Events, and then clicking the subtab labeled Bear Webinar Series. Our next webinar will be March 13th, and we will hear from Anjali Chenani from the Government Lab Philadelphia, from the City of Philadelphia. Thank you all for attending, and you can exit this webinar by closing the WebEx screen.